been trucking through life as a college student for about 3 years now. Late-night study sessions, cold pizza, and the sound of rustling leaves in the courtyard have become my norm. The university I attend is old, founded over a century ago, and with age comes history, stories, and rumors that echo through the hallways. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on that one fateful night. It was my 3rd year, and I'd just been assigned to a dorm on the older side of campus, Dorm Hall B. The place had its share of myths. One story always stood out, the legend of the silent floor. It was said that on the 13th of every month, the 3rd floor became different. Whispers spread about how strange sounds could be heard, how doors would slam on their own, and how students would mysteriously feel watched, even when they were alone. Most laughed it off as nothing more than an urban legend, a way to mess with freshmen, but something about it always gave me chills. One night, I found myself up late, cramming for an exam. The common room was empty, and the only light came from the flickering lamp overhead. I was lost in my notes when I felt a sudden cold draft sweep through the room. Goosebumps crawled up my arms, and I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued to study when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was soft at first, almost as if someone was gently knocking on a door, but then it grew louder. My heart raced, and I realized it was coming from the hallway. I mustered up some courage, telling myself it was just one of the other students playing a prank, and opened the door. The hallway stretched out, empty and dimly lit. No one was there. I stepped out and looked around, but as I turned back to my room, something caught my eye. The door to room 313, which was supposed to be locked and vacant for the semester, stood slightly ajar. Curiosity tugged at me. I knew that room had a reputation. Supposedly, years ago, a student named Emily had lived there, and one night, she'd simply vanished. No trace, no explanation, nothing. They said she'd been working on a project late at night, much like I was, when she disappeared. After that, no one wanted to live in room 313, and the university eventually stopped assigning it to anyone. I felt a chill run down my spine, but decided to push the door open a bit more. The room was dark, with the moonlight seeping through the blinds, casting eerie shadows across the floor. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence, and I jumped. It was a text from my friend Mark. "Where are you? Thought you were in your room?" I replied. "I am. Just checking something out on the 3rd floor." Mark's response came quickly. "Dude, get out of there now." My blood ran cold. I typed back, "Why?" He replied, "Just leave. I'll explain later." I felt a sense of urgency, but something compelled me to stay. I glanced around the room again, and that's when I saw it. A notebook on the desk, untouched by time, covered in dust. It had Emily's name etched into the cover. I don't know why, but I reached out and flipped it open. Pages filled with frantic scribbles and half-drawn symbols stared back at me. Words like trapped, help, and can't escape appeared over and over. My heart pounded as I read the final page, written in large, shaky letters. "It watches. It waits. Don't turn around." The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. My instincts screamed to run, but my feet felt glued to the spot. Then I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't from the hallway. It was right behind me. I swallowed hard, the fear gripping my chest like a vice, and slowly turned around. At first, there was nothing but darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was Emily, or at least, it looked like her. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and hollow, staring straight at me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed to the mirror on the wall. I hesitated, but my body moved on its own, drawn toward the mirror. When I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. Instead, I saw countless students, their faces twisted in fear, all staring back at me. And there, right in the center, was Emily. She mouthed one word, "Run." Suddenly, the door to room 313 slammed shut, snapping me out of my trance. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping sound grew louder, now coming from all sides, echoing through the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. I screamed, pounded on the door, desperate to get out, when I felt something icy wrap around my wrist. I looked down and saw Emily's hand, cold and lifeless, pulling me toward the mirror. "No," I shouted, yanking my arm free. I banged on the door with all my strength, and finally, it flew open. I stumbled out into the hallway, heart racing, and sprinted back to my room without looking back. I burst into my room and locked the door, breathing heavily, my body trembling with fear. My phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "Are you okay?" He texted. "No," I replied, fingers shaking. "What happened? What's going on?" He responded, "I was reading up on the 3rd floor. They say it's not Emily that haunts it. They say it's something else, something that mimics her, luring people into that room." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I went to the campus administration to ask about room 313. They brushed it off, told me it was just an old room, nothing special. But when I left, I overheard one of the janitors mutter, "It always comes back on the 13th. I moved out of that dorm the very next day. I haven't gone back since, but every now and then I dream about that room, and I still hear the tapping, always getting closer. I'd been attending the college for about 3 years and thought I'd seen every part of the campus. But during my final semester, I learned there was one building I'd never heard of before, Henderson Hall. It was an old brick structure tucked away in a corner of the campus, hidden behind the newer dorms and science labs. It wasn't on any of the campus maps, and no one ever seemed to talk about it. I first learned about it when I heard some students joking about a ghost phone in the building. They said it was a prank, a busted old payphone that would ring at exactly midnight. If you answered, you'd hear your own voice whispering things you hadn't even said yet. At first, I thought it was just another dumb urban legend, the kind that every campus has, but curiosity got the better of me. After all, I was studying folklore and ghost stories as part of my English major, so this seemed like the perfect thing to investigate. One chilly Friday night, I decided to find Henderson Hall. It wasn't easy. I had to cut through an overgrown path behind the library, where the branches scraped at my jacket like bony fingers. The building itself looked ancient, with boarded-up windows and a faded sign that barely hinted at its name. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed open the creaky front door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust hung in the air, and I could feel the cold seeping through the walls. As I walked down the narrow hallway, my footsteps echoed unnervingly. There was a strange, musty smell, and the walls were covered with faded flyers and posters from decades ago. Then I found it. A payphone mounted on the wall at the end of the hallway. It looked ancient, like something straight out of a 1970s horror movie, with a cracked black receiver and a rusted coin slot. I stared at it for a moment, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The phone was silent, just hanging there like a relic from another time. I checked my watch. 11:58 p.m. I leaned against the wall, feeling foolish for even thinking this was real. But then, as the second hand ticked toward midnight, I heard it. The sound echoed through the empty hall, louder than it should have been, piercing the silence. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. It rang again and again. Finally, with a trembling hand, I picked up the receiver. "Hello," whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper on the other end. It was my voice. But it wasn't saying anything I'd ever said. It was repeating the same phrase over and over. "You have to leave. You have to leave. You have to leave." I dropped the phone, my heart racing. It clattered against the wall, but the whispering continued, louder now, more frantic. "You have to leave. You have to leave. You have to leave." I turned to run, but as I did, I noticed something. There was writing on the wall beside the phone. Faint, scratched into the plaster. It was a list of names, and at the very bottom was mine. I staggered back, my mind reeling, and that's when I saw her. A girl stood at the end of the hallway, just beyond the flickering light. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her hair tangled and messy, and her eyes were wide and hollow. She raised a finger to her lips, as if to shush me, and then she spoke. "You can't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing with mine. "You have to leave before he finds you." I didn't wait to find out who he was. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, not stopping until I burst through the front door and back into the cold night air. I kept running until I was back at my dorm, my lungs burning, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next morning, I went to the campus library and asked the librarian about Henderson Hall. She gave me a puzzled look and said, "There hasn't been a Henderson Hall on this campus for at least 30 years. It burned down in the 80s after a student died in a fire there." I felt my blood turn to ice. I asked if she had any records about it, and after some digging, she found an old newspaper article. It mentioned the fire, the death of a student named Lisa Thompson, and a rumor about how she had tried to call for help from the payphone in the hallway, but no one answered. For a few nights, I tried to put it behind me, but something kept nagging at the back of my mind. I kept hearing that phone ring, faint and distant, like it was calling to me. Then, one night, I was woken by a ringing sound coming from my desk. I froze and stared at my cell phone. It wasn't lit up. The sound wasn't coming from it. I turned my head toward my closet and saw it. The payphone standing there in the shadows. It was just like the one in Henderson Hall, down to the cracks on the receiver and the rusted coin slot. It rang again, louder this time. My body moved on its own, reaching for it despite every fiber of my being telling me to run. As soon as I picked up the receiver, I heard my own voice again, whispering urgently, "He's coming. You have to leave. Now." I dropped the phone and backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. And then I saw him, a shadowy figure, stepping out of the mirror beside my bed, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. As he stepped closer, I felt an overwhelming coldness wash over me, freezing me in place. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was his voice, deep and hollow, whispering in my ear, "You should have left." When I woke up, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. The phone was gone, and everything seemed normal until I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. There, scratched faintly into the glass, was my name. I moved out the next day, refusing to set foot in that dorm again. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, just a trick of my imagination. But every night, as I lie in bed, I can still hear that faint, echoing ring, growing louder and closer, calling for me once more. I had always loved exploring old buildings and places no one else cared about. Before college, I'd spent most of my time sneaking into abandoned houses, looking for relics of the past. It was an obsession, really. So, when I heard about the locked-up lecture hall on the far side of campus, I couldn't resist checking it out. The hall was called Hargrave Hall, a massive, crumbling structure that had been closed off years ago after some sort of accident. No one knew exactly what happened, but rumors floated around about a fire that broke out during a late-night lecture. They said the place was cursed, that anyone who stepped inside would never be the same. Of course, that only made me more curious. One night, I decided to sneak inside. My friend Emily reluctantly agreed to come with me. We'd done this kind of thing before, urban exploring, breaking into old, abandoned places. But this felt different. The air around Hargrave Hall was thick with a kind of tension that made my skin crawl. As we approached the entrance, Emily hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, it'll be fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just a quick look around, and then we're out." The door was surprisingly easy to open. We stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. It was dark, but I could make out rows of old wooden seats, arranged in a semicircle around a central stage. As we walked further in, our footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence. My flashlight flickered, and that's when I saw it. An old, dusty projector sitting on a table at the front of the hall. "Look at this," I said, pointing it out. "It must be decades old." We approached the projector, and I noticed something strange. A reel of film was still loaded inside, as if someone had left it there years ago. Without thinking, I reached out and turned it on. The machine whirred to life, and an image flickered on the screen at the front of the room. It was an old black and white film, showing a professor standing at a podium, lecturing to a room full of students. The film was grainy, but I could just make out his expression. He looked nervous, almost terrified. Then, without warning, the screen went black. Suddenly, all the lights in the hall flickered on. I froze, looking around in confusion. The seats that had been empty moments ago were now filled with shadowy figures, all facing forward, staring silently at the screen. Emily gasped, grabbing my arm. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's just get out of here." But before we could move, the screen flickered back to life. This time, it showed a different image. A close-up of one of the seats, the one I was standing next to. I looked down and saw something carved into the wood, my name. "Did you do this?" I asked Emily, panic rising in my chest. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "I didn't touch anything." The screen changed again, now showing the professor looking directly at the camera, his eyes filled with fear. He mouthed something, but there was no sound. Then, as if on cue, the projector began to slow down, and the lights flickered out, plunging us into darkness. We heard a creak, like someone shifting in their seat. My heart pounded in my ears as I swung my flashlight around, trying to see who or what was moving. The beam of light landed on one of the shadowy figures. It was staring at me, its face completely blank, featureless like a mannequin. And then, slowly, it began to stand. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing Emily's hand. But as we turned to run, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. Desperation took over, and I began pounding on the door. "Let us out," I shouted, but no one answered. I turned back toward the seats, and that's when I saw it. All the figures were now standing, their faces turned toward us. They moved in unison, stepping forward, closer and closer. Emily screamed, and I grabbed the projector, throwing it at the nearest figure. It shattered on impact, and the lights flickered back on. In that instant, every shadowy figure disappeared, as if they had never been there. Emily and I wasted no time. We threw open the door and bolted out of Hargrave Hall, not stopping until we were halfway across campus. We didn't speak about what happened, and we promised never to go back. The next day, I tried to find out more about Hargrave Hall. I went to the campus archives and found an old newspaper article from the 1950s. It talked about a professor who went mad during a late-night lecture, attacking his students before setting the hall on fire. They never found out why he did it, but some of the students claimed they saw the figures moving in the dark before it happened. I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I close my eyes, I see them, those blank, featureless faces, staring at me from the darkness. And sometimes when I'm walking across campus at night, I hear the faint whirring of a projector behind me, just before the lights start to flicker.